I would just say like get stuck in. I think you can get started a lot quicker than people think, and get to that point, within a couple of weeks of starting even faster than that. And then you can look at, going into more detail on those like really impactful areas of your business, or based on like your goal, you might choose like not to do that at all, right? But at least you're tracking something and you have an idea of what's going on in the business.
Welcome to Survey Booker Sessions. Tune in to hear from people working in a range of industries and roles to provide you ideas that you can take away and use in your own business. I'm your host, Matt Nally, the founder and director of Survey Booker, which is the leading CRM and survey management system for surveyors. So on today's episode, we have Elliot, who is the co-founder of Consequence. So thanks for coming on today, Elliot.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, great to be here.
Do you want to give us an overview of what Consequence is and how you got started with it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. Great to be here. So Consequence, like, who are we, what we do? I mean, to start off with, we help businesses to achieve net zero. So that's the sort of short story of what we do. We've been doing this business for 2.5 years now. And even the name was pretty deliberate, and Consequence, being something actually broader than even net zero. And what do we mean by net zero, right? This is to do with carbon and emissions and the stuff that we hear in the news all the time. But my co-founder and I started this business with my brother, James. We were thinking about how do we help businesses to take accountability for what we term like externalities of doing business. And one of them is carbon, right? But it's also a lot of, mainly we focus on environmental, but we know that there's like social and other externalities of doing business. But, carbon, water use, land use, impacts on biodiversity, all these things have an impact and a sort of like a social cost. And our approach was not to, was to be supportive of business leaders to take accountability and be able to do something useful with that information. So we started the business 2.5 years ago, been helping and focused on the carbon issue to begin with, and helping businesses to get to net zero.
I suppose that's a nice segue into, is it worth covering what net zero is, or certified net zero, or carbon neutral? Because there's lots of different terms that get sort of spouted about.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of different definitions, and they're changing all the time, like you say. And I think the most important thing for people to remember, and when we talk with our customers, is it's actually about the story that you build around, like, the claim that you make, like we are carbon neutral or certified net zero, whatever that is going to be, because there are different authoritative sources that run different definitions. And so just because you're doing it one way doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing it wrong, but it's really important to like know the difference. So carbon neutral has been around for a lot longer than net zero, and carbon neutral really means like, are you offsetting, or you're basically putting emissions out by driving your car around, heating your office, buying equipment that you do for surveying sites. Are you then offsetting that or mitigating it with like a carbon offset project? And so to be carbon neutral would be, all the emissions you put out, minus all the emissions that you mitigate, would be carbon neutral. And then net zero was where, and again, there's a couple of different definitions here, and I'll give sort of like two different ones. So the addition to carbon neutral on one of them was looking at all of the sort of indirect emissions of your business. So things that you don't directly control. So it's like looking at like the emissions that come from the products from your suppliers, for example, and then, offsetting and mitigating those, you could consider yourself to be net zero. And then I think the one that's the most prominent now, and the one that, say, like the UK government is signed up to, really is, we're talking about net zero 2050, and then like, short-term targets at 2030. These are all around like a science-based target approach to net zero that talks about, we need to limit global warming by a certain amount, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And net zero says that we need to actually reduce our emissions by a certain percentage and then mitigate or offset the remaining amount. So net zero, if you got like a 2050 target, would require you to reduce your emissions by 95%, roughly from what it is today, and then only offset the final 5%. So that's the big difference between the two. If you're actually going to sign up to net zero, it's going to put a lot more sort of pressure on you to actually look at what you're doing in your business and actually change it rather than just purchasing offsets.
It's quite a tough difference, actually. Do you think there's going to be a move towards, I suppose, more initially, a move with more businesses going carbon neutral? But do you think there's going to be a big shift towards net zero, or is it really quite onerous to achieve?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think the way that I talk to customers about it is you're going to do carbon neutral first, because net zero is something that you can't do alone, because it's designed in a very particular way such that it relies also on your other stakeholders that you do business with, your suppliers, and also your customers, as well as what you do yourself. So if you've got a big office that you rent, if the landlord isn't using renewable energy for that, it's going to be very difficult for you to get down to net zero, right? So I think carbon neutral is sort of like a more achievable early step. You can pretty much achieve that from day one, because you can purchase these offsets to mitigate, and that has a lot of good advantages. However, I just think where the world is going, the reasons for getting into carbon neutral and net zero in the first place, right? You've got the sort of like, the social global good that you want to do as an individual in a business, but then there's also the business opportunity that comes with taking action. And there's also the risk of inaction in the space, and carbon offsetting and carbon neutrality is certainly like coming under more scrutiny and more fire. So net zero it's a lot more ambitious as a goal, but it's something that if you're sort of like making progress towards, you're when you come under that scrutiny, you're likely to come out better than if you're just doing carbon neutral. I say all that like if you're a small growing business, and you're growing, or you're just a small business, like net zero can be very, very difficult for you to achieve, because you need to influence, your suppliers. You need to influence other people. And if you're an SME, you only have so much, power to do that. So, it's difficult. And that's why, like, right at the beginning, I think it's like really important about like the story that you tell. I've talked to companies. Actually, it was a construction company in the US. They were up in the Detroit area, and they've been doing this stuff before net zero came into vogue. They've been doing it for 10 plus years, and they don't really have like a badge or anything that says, hey, we're carbon neutral or we're net zero, but they've got all the data in there. They're doing all the reporting. They are doing offsets, and they're also, building a story about how like they're choosing different materials, or they're doing different design decisions in order to like reduce the impact of these buildings that they're constructing. So, at that perspective, you've got a really strong story. And if you do that, you can almost worry about these certain certifications less when you're of a certain size organization like that. If you're a bit smaller.
Yeah. It's a good point. It's in terms of the where do you start? If you're an SME, I think it potentially seems quite daunting, because there are a lot of I suppose different options out there in terms. Well, I don't know what's best. So you've got things like planting trees, one tree for every customer it might be, or however someone sets that up. And then there's platforms like yours where I found it very, very easy coming onto it. And this isn't obviously meant to be a plug at Consequence specifically, but it's very easy. You just sort of, I suppose, plug in your accounting feed or bank feed, and it just gets calculated, and then you've got your figure at the end. But is there a right a better route, or are there some routes that aren't as beneficial as they sort of suggest they might be? Because we hear lots of things about, I don't know, trees get planted, but how many actually survive and all this kind of stuff. So
there's two sides, I think, to the question. One is, how do you determine what your carbon footprint is? And there are different methods of doing that. And then there's, how do you do mitigation? When we talk about mitigation, we've already talked about reduction. So it's like changing what you do. And then there's carbon offsets, which is to sort of net out the emissions that you haven't been able to reduce. On the calculation side, it all goes back to like what your goal is, and with the claim that you want to put out there, because especially as an SME, right? And I think if you're less than 100 people, I would have different advice to that sort of size business versus, someone that's over 100 or 250 or 1,000 even, right? If we still consider that to be a medium size company. So based on that claim, like, and what do I mean by that is, are you putting it out in public or is it internal, right? What kind of claim are you making? Are you saying carbon neutral or net zero, or are you just saying that you want to take accountability and it's something that's more vague? Are you having to use it in bids to win business? So it's like a compliance thing. Based on that claim and that goal, that really drives and guides both those other two things that we do, like when it comes to measurement and when it comes to mitigation. So in the measurement side, there are solutions out there that are great in that they require absolutely no effort. You'll go in, you just put in how many employees you have, and it does an average estimate based on the carbon footprint of the average person in the UK, and which is like roughly 10 tons a year, and then it will allow you to start planting trees, right? But that's great because it's easy. The downside of that is you have no visibility into your carbon footprint, and you have no ability, therefore, to make any changes. And so I would say that's only suitable for a very light claim that you're going to make, or it's not even useful internally, right? It's a bit of smoke and mirrors, frankly, in my opinion. On that, you can't really make any positive changes. So a tool like Consequence allows you to go very, very deep into the data. But what we try and do is bring in a lot of automation to help save time, so it's still easy for you, like you've said. And so you'll bring in these different data sources and do these calculations. And with bigger companies, there's also all these other steps that you can also go through, because you need to be that much more rigorous based on the claims that you're making. I can go into that in more detail if you've got a follow-up question on that. And then, the mitigation side, that's a whole thing. That's short of the question that says, like, to Consequence, that says, like, can you explain how you do calculation? Asking about our offset portfolio or just asking for advice on offsets is like the number one question that we get, because we see it in the news all the time, and so it's like a high risk thing. Like, you might be putting a substantial amount of money into an offset. Offsets cost anything from, let's just say, £10 up to well over £100 per ton. So, if your business is 10 people, let's just say your carbon footprint might be 200 tons. You might be talking about several $1,000s, or even over 10,000 or pounds, I should say, which is like a significant amount of money, right? And then when you get the scrutiny on what you've done with it, you got to be careful. So there's a framework for sort of assessing carbon offset projects, and there's, as with the carbon neutral net zero piece and the definitions, there also isn't like complete agreement on offsets. So it's very difficult for people. So the approach that we've taken to date is to have like a portfolio. So we're thinking about the risk to our customers and spreading that risk amongst like multiple projects. So one could be about planting trees, another could be about renewable energy, one could be about like direct carbon capture from the air, using some sort of like new technology. And by having a mix of projects, you're sort of like protecting yourself from some of the risk, because like you said, it's like, and it has happened, is a big corporate spends £1 million on planting a forest, and then 5 years later it burns down, there's a forest fire. So it's like, then technically you need to spend that money again, because it does take carbon offsets from planting trees is based on like the life of the tree. So tree lasts several decades, right? So if it burns down after 5 years, then you've got to do something about it. So it's a tough one.
But yeah, so the tree one I find fascinating, as far as there's lots of stuff about it being very good, and there've been good projects, but equally somewhere finding 1,000 trees have been planted and then 3 survived, because they weren't properly looked after and so on. So you're right, it must be a challenge finding the right projects and so on. You touched on people having different motivations for why they would do it, so whether it's internal or external and so on. What do you find when people are coming to you are the reasons that they are looking to do it? Is it a PR tool, or are there genuine reasons behind sort of why they're looking to offset?
It's a good question, and I think with all the people that we're working with and talking to, there is a desire to do good, to reduce the impact on the environment. But I think with most companies, if not all companies, they are still looking for an ROI on this, right? Because it does require time, and it does require money in order to, one, understand what's going on in your business, and then two, to do all this mitigation stuff that we talked about. There are costs involved, so people are trying to see like, okay, how can we get a return? And today, it can be really, really powerful to your branding and your messaging to integrate into that carbon neutrality or some sort of net zero that's backed up by rigorous like calculations that you've done, so that people can obviously trust what you've done. So we very much are seeing that, like, the individuals that we're talking to in the businesses, like, they really care about this, and that's why we see this with a lot of founders of startups and SMEs that today, that they are thinking about this like out of the gate, from day one. They're thinking about, okay, how can we approach this in the right way, which is great. But even in those bigger organizations, the individuals are thinking and they really care, but they also are cognizant that like the business needs to get a return, because it is money that's going to have to be spent on this problem.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think, I suppose my main motivation for doing it was just wanting to be consistent with, if I'm washing out a tin can at home and putting it into a recycling bin, it's then pointless. Completely, mitigating that with bad practice at work. So, for me, it was about being consistent with what we were doing personally and then what we were doing as a business. What are the types of things that surveyors might not think about in terms of the types of things that are adding sort of to their carbon costs as a business? I think the very obvious one might be driving a car to get to appointments, but what are the ones that people don't think about as much?
I think the big one that we see is like technology that's being used, because a lot of the news cycle around carbon is to do with like manufacturing and cars and transport and flying in planes, and we forget that for every piece of technology that we're using, it's being hosted in a data center somewhere. And that's like a massive facility that's being, air cooled or water cooled, and it's pumping out tons of heat, and it's, tens of thousands of servers, right? Like burning loads of energy, for the electricity that they need. So if we're spending a lot on, all the different software packages that we have, whilst if you've got a fleet of cars, it's not going to be as much. It's still going to be, a contributing factor. And the bigger you get, obviously, just like the bigger that could be. So that's been a common one that we've seen. And I think more broadly, it's just like everything in your supply chain. So as a surveyor, if you're using, you know, and I can't remember what the tools are, right? But you've got like the setting out, the machines that will point the what is it, like the lasers to do like the layout of a site and things like that, right? Those pieces of equipment were, they're produced in a factory. So very commonly when we talk to customers, they think about, okay, well, my carbon footprint comes from how I use this product, right? So it has a battery in it and I recharge the battery. Okay, there's some electricity used there. But that may only be, over the life of that product, say like 50% of its overall carbon footprint. The other 50% comes from, basically like extracting all of the metals and other materials that needed to go into making it, and then transporting them, and then actually like assembling this piece of equipment that you're using every day in your job, right? When you go out on site. And that's what you call like an embodied carbon footprint, because by the time you've got all that carbon has already been expended. But the way that carbon footprinting works is because you purchased it and you used it, essentially that carbon was created by your choice, right? It was your choice to purchase it and you needed to use it for your business. And therefore, that's why when it comes to carbon footprint reporting, you have to take accountability like for that impact. And that, goes all the way back to the start where I said it's about like, it's about your supply chain, these other people that you're working with. So there are some of these ones that are like, I guess, less in your face than, sticking petrol in the car and driving, or, heating and lighting your office. There's all these other impacts as well.
I suppose two things from that. We'll have to make sure we're offsetting all of our podcast views as part of our our carbon offsetting, because it's true. They're obviously, that's a lot of what we're offsetting is data centers and computers in use for coding and all that kind of stuff. I think the other question I've got from that is if you're working on net zero, where you're working with suppliers and customers to offset across everything, is there an element there where, and this probably isn't necessarily a bad thing, but where you've got sort of companies and I suppose offsetting the same thing, because the company that's made the product has offset the carbon cost there, but me as a as a business who's bought that, I'm then offsetting too, or does that happen there?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And that is why you'll see some of the bigger companies, just choosing not to offset these parts of their supply chain. Like if you can look up like Walmart, for example, right? I think they just buy billions of products every year. So the carbon footprint is just absolutely gigantic. And so like from a cost perspective, they just cannot afford to to pay for the offsets for that. So they will just do like direct energy use for heating and cooling their facilities, and they'll do like business travel, right? So it absolutely happens. And again, that goes back to the story that you want to tell. But the standards and where like scrutiny is going is that these impacts were caused because of as a consequence of a decision that you made in your business, right? So if you didn't buy those products, it reduces demand, and that would ultimately reduce production of those products, and so carbon release would be reduced. But like explicitly on your question, there's this thing called like double counting, and the actual standards of like the work that we've done, with Survey Booker on your carbon footprint, is split into three sections. You've got scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 is like basically like direct energy use in facilities and vehicles that you own. So like putting petrol in the car and running your car, that's scope 1. Scope 2 is electricity for the office. And then scope 3 is everything else in your supply chain. And then it's how your customers use your own products. And so by the very nature of that, all of that's double counted, as is your electricity in scope 2, right? Because go into the details too much. So it's designed to be all sort of like double counted, like from a measurement perspective. The reason for that, and what's neat about it, is it means that you pick any position in the supply chain or the value chain, you can see all the emissions, if you've done it well, all the emissions that came before and all the emissions that come after, right? From where that business sits in a value chain. That's how it's designed. But that builds in double counting. And then the other half of the problem is like double spend, which is where, okay, do we offset that impact? And that really is, a decision for the business, to take, right? So if you want to be a leader in the space, then it's a very simple decision to just sort of like offset the entirety of scope 3. But what it also does is it helps encourage you to look at, okay, how can we change our behavior? How can we change the decisions that we're making? Can we work with our suppliers to see if like there's a different piece of equipment that is a much like less carbon intensive manufacturing process or something, right? And ultimately, the way it's designed is so that like you start talking to certain key suppliers and you put pressure on them, and then when all their other customers are also putting pressure on them, obviously there's enough for them to make a change, and then produce less carbon in the first place. And then I guess like the final thing to say on it is, it's really, really difficult because of the nature of how complicated like a supply chain is to pinpoint who is responsible for like what bit of carbon that's been released. Like if you're buying like a piece of equipment or you buy a car, right? Is it, the Toyota that's responsible, or is it like the 1,000 different suppliers that they have? And then those suppliers also have 1,000 suppliers. So like, one of the things that we're working on at Consequence is a way to package up the carbon emissions, and then to be able to share that up and down supply chains, so that you can drive true accountability and like transparency in the supply chain, so that when you do come to purchasing offsets, you can say, I know for a fact that these impacts were offset, and so we're not going to spend that money. We're going to do something else with that cash that we're saving. Maybe we're going to reinvest that in like more reduction strategies that we're working on. Taking trains rather than flying or something. Maybe that has even has an increased cost. So no easy answers to these ones, Matt. But hopefully
no, I don't think there's an easy answer to many things around this. There's a lot of nuances and complexities to it, but I suppose, as you say, it's about at least starting somewhere and making the small steps to begin with. On that note, then, if you are an SME, what are the sort of the first things you can do, like to start, I suppose, reducing your impact or offsetting? Because I suppose, you're driving a car fine, you're using your iPad and your phone when you're out on site, and your laptop when you're back home. You've got your tools like your laser scanners and thermal imaging cameras and drones and stuff like that. And with all of that going on, and customers as well reading reports on their phones and stuff, what are the steps that surveyors can take to potentially start to mitigate that, or at least reduce impact?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really difficult one to answer. I think what it requires, is to actually like measure what's happening, because everyone we do sort of like know broadly, like, okay, it's probably going to be the vehicles, it's probably going to be some of the equipment that we're using, and it's going to be like running the office, and maybe that's going to be the biggest parts of a surveyor's impact. I mean, the first thing I recommend if people are serious about it is actually doing calculations, so that you can really get an insight into what's going on, because it might surprise you, right? So once you've got the data and you're tracking the data, obviously that allows you to like make decisions. And if you're doing it blind, it's like super difficult. And that's where, like, once you've got the data, you know your business, and you know what's practical, and you can talk to suppliers and things, and you can sort of like make plans. If you don't track any of the data, then all you can ever do is have a very high level conversation about, hey, I think probably if we, drove the vehicle fleet less, then it would reduce emissions. But how are you going to do that as a business? Because that's what's driving top line as well, right? You've got to get out to site. So, but it may be, certainly with, medium to larger organizations where you're going to like conferences and things, how do you get there? Like if like the average carbon footprint of a person in the UK every year is like roughly 10 tons, let's say. And then if you fly, like return to Los Angeles from London and you do it business class, you're going to be, roughly like, I think that's like roughly 10 tons or something that could be. It's multiple tons just for one flight. So if you're going to a conference somewhere and you're flying 5 or 10 salespeople there, obviously that can have then a huge influence on the overall carbon footprint of the business and massively outweigh everything else. Like if you look at professional services firms, like, you look at like Big Four and just everyone, typically business travel is over 80% of the carbon footprint of that business, right? So that might be one sort of like practical way. So what do companies do? They start traveling by train rather than flying. They try and do more stuff remote. Unfortunately, there's like not a lot of like sexy ways of like reducing your carbon footprint. It does require like behavior change, and some of that stuff can be a bit painful.
I think, yeah, that's a very good point on the data side, because you can have things that might be more obvious in terms of the bigger things that you're aware of, but there are lots of little things you'll do that you don't realize how much they're adding up. But not only from a general cost perspective, but if you don't know the actual carbon cost of each activity, then you don't know which one's having the actual biggest carbon impact, rather than, you might think it's one thing and it could be completely different.
Yeah.
And then you focus on the wrong area.
I mean, one controversial thing, Matt, that can be controversial and something that I believe absolutely is like, right now I'm and I can see like, challenges on both sides, but it's a little bit controversial. It's like I drive around in like, I live in Austin, Texas, for one thing. So I drive around in quite a large vehicle. It's like a Nissan Pathfinder. I think the engine's like a 4-liter engine. It's like a V10. I think it does like, 14 miles to the gallon or something, right? So it's like not very fuel efficient. But it's like a 15-year-old car as well. And so obviously there's a lot of, noise out there saying, hey, and there's a lot of businesses like doing this where they replace their vehicle fleet with fully electric or hybrid vehicles, right? But just we had the example of like the piece of surveying equipment that 50% of its carbon footprint was from manufacturing it. Hey, guess what? It's the same with like running a car, because it's a highly complex like thing that you're buying, and it has a massive supply chain where stuff's been shipped all over the world, and being dug out of the ground, and that has a carbon footprint, so that's why I still run around with that car. But when I buy the next car, when I'm going to replace it, that's when I would look at an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, because that is going to be on balance versus buying like another like full combustion engine car, gonna have like a lower impact. So I think that's like obviously something that's more medium long term for businesses, but as they like look at their fleets and look at renewing them, right, you can look at hybrid and electric vehicles as one way of reducing the carbon footprint.
It's funny you bring up that point, because I've been having the same conversation actually around here with ULEZ, which is planning to expand. And so where I am at the moment, a lot of the cars will no longer meet the standards, and therefore will have to be but obviously you had to pay for it each day or get rid of it. And then there's been that whole debate as to, is that better for the environment? Like, yes, slightly cleaner air here, but you've now got to scrap that car. So there's a carbon cost of, the machinery and processes to scrap it, plus build a new car just to be slightly more efficient on carbon when you're driving. And it's very hard to make that decision. Should you actually just wait a bit longer because it's better for the environment overall, just to get more use out of what's already been produced, or do you switch over to something else? But on that note, if you're looking to try and make changes, I suppose a lot of what we've looked at so far is reactive, in terms of you get the data in, then you react to what you're seeing, and then you go and make a change. If you're looking to do things next, and therefore sort of the more proactive element, is there data you can look at to see the impact of the potential purchase you're going to make? Is it easy to find that data, or is that all quite difficult?
The nice thing is that you can do it using the same reference data, because the way that like carbon measurement works is you take a piece of input data, which is like, I drove 10 miles or I used 10 liters of petrol. And then there's a piece of reference data that says, 10 miles is equivalent to this much carbon, or 10 liters of petrol is equivalent to this much carbon. They call them emissions factors. You can use those same pieces of reference data to do like forecasting as well, right? So you could be saying, okay, well, if I'm about to buy the vehicle fleet, I'm going to buy 10 vans. Okay, I could run them diesel, electric, hybrid. This is how we expect to use them, right? And then you in a system like Consequence and many others, you use the same reference data that you would for historical reporting to like go, okay, hey, what's going to happen in the future? And then that can help you then make a decision before it's actually happened.
And is it possible to do that with other things, like the type of software you're using or the type of tool you might want to buy, or is it get a bit too complex there?
Yeah, the availability of data is like way harder in that space. Because it's certainly in software, like a lot of the time, what you're looking at is like a piece of reference data that's like based on an average. So comparing one piece of software to another, you'd be using the same average reference data, and so you can't differentiate. Some of the work that we've done is, working with the major companies around the world to, understand their carbon footprints and use that to generate reference data that would allow you to like compare, right? We're going to use, I'm trying to think of a piece of software like Zoom versus like Google Meet or something, right? And it would allow you to look at, okay, if I spent £100 with Google, if I spent £100 with Zoom, to actually see a different impact on those two decisions that you could make. So a lot of that ultimately means that you're looking at the supplier's data, right? And that is where that can become very difficult, because it's not easy to find. It's not accessible. It's sometimes when you find it, it's not in a format that you can understand. I have a team that works full time on researching, doing quality assurance checks on, and then building this reference data from companies all around the world. So we look at their carbon footprint reports, we check that they are of a good enough quality, and then we build them into these reference data that gets used when we do calculations for customers. So no silver bullet there, but there are ways. And what we found is the longer that companies are actually tracking their emissions and looking at dashboards that have like real data in, that like new solutions and new ideas of like what you can do, will come to you, right? If you're not measuring it, then you're just like never going to be able to do anything about it. But if you start, then you can start making those incremental steps. You'll probably start with the really easy things like looking at energy, and that goes to like driving behavior changes in the office, like turning off all equipment when you leave. Like that can actually have a material impact over the course of a year. Changing commuting habits for your staff. some of those things are like the low hanging fruit, but as you're tracking all the data, you can start to sort of like see more insightful things that you could do that might take a bit more effort and are a bit more complicated as well. And so that's why, like, when you're looking at the data, it is backwards looking, but based on that, your business, and that, like, typically you're running it the same way next year, right? So you can use it for forward looking decision making, like before these things have actually occurred. So it can still be really helpful for that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of interesting bits there. There's the simple things you can do in terms of like turning the lights off before you leave, and maybe even changing when you go to work. So you go before rush hour or after rush hour, so you're not sat in traffic and burning fuel. But one of the things you touched on there was you have a team of people that look through all the data and calculate everything. I know at the moment we offset at 150% of our carbon usage that we've calculated, just to be safe whilst we're building up an accurate picture. But how do you ensure that the calculations that are being made can be relied upon? They're accurate, or accurate as you can be.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's supported by there being a global standard, and so we build our software in compliance with that global standard, and the way that the standard is designed is it does actually give you flexibility. So there are multiple ways of calculating the carbon footprint of a given activity, like driving your car to the office, and that flexibility is there because everyone knows that people have a different ability to get access to the data, right, based on the type of company and the type of activity. So what we always say to our clients is it's about thinking about the claim that you're making, right, in terms of, is it public, is it internal, is it carbon neutral, is it net zero, like, what are you using it for, in terms of, like, are you using it very strongly as like a sales and marketing tool? Because all of that reflects on the scrutiny that you're going to get, and therefore the detail and the accuracy that you need to go to. With a system like Consequence, we'll work at all levels of accuracy, and so one of the things that you might do is do like an initial calculation that's more high level, it's faster, it costs you less to get the results, and then you'll be able to identify, okay, here are certain spots in our carbon footprint that are very, very impactful, and those are ones where you want to spend more time and more effort and more investment to collect more data, like we've done, looking at how a customer of a software company uses their product, the energy use profile of that product, right? Because it's sort of a bit of a black hole. And then actually doing like energy calculations based on that, which is like, from a standards perspective, is like in full compliance with what you have to do. So mitigating at 150%, as you're saying, though, is like this extra step that you can take to safeguard yourself, both in the short and the long term, honestly, because there's always uncertainty. There's both uncertainty in the data that you're collecting, right? Especially as your business grows. Is your entire team, actually tracking the amount of fuel that's getting used when they're driving their car? Or, when you're doing the commute, do you actually know the distance that they're traveling? There are all these like parameters and things. There's a lot of information. So you're trying to make it easy, right? So there's some uncertainty there. And then the reference data that you're using to convert it into a carbon footprint is also based on lots of different, calculations that were done by scientists to go with all that different type of data that you're using. So there is uncertainty. It's inherent in the process. And so I guess it's like leaving advice for people, like even companies that have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds a year on doing their carbon footprints, often build in a buffer when it comes to mitigation because of this uncertainty. And that's why building the story, I think, is so important, because even if you make a mistake, or you do a calculation incorrectly, you underestimate something, if you're building a story around it and if you're putting your foot forward in the right direction, what we found is that people will tend to be more forgiving of that. versus being opaque about what you're doing, not bothering to tell a story, and then people finding errors, and then obviously you can have issues there. So our software takes the standards, puts it into code, so you can't do any fiddling around with how calculations are done. So it's very trustworthy for our customers to know it's going to be done repeatably, accurately. And then there is that decision that you make around mitigation and just adding a bit of padding in just to take account for the very likely uncertainty that there is, because it's not an exact science. It's more of like an engineering task that you're going through.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I suppose my final question, and maybe slightly putting you on the spot before we go, is what if someone wants to get started with this? What are the top tips for, you don't know where to begin and how to get into it?
If it was me, I would find a software platform that's going to automate as much of the work as possible. Actually, the calculations, like there's all these methodologies and things, they're very long. They can be quite confusing. What you want to do, or what I would want to do, is I want to focus on building my business. So I want to find someone that has a software platform that's going to make this easy for me. And I want to look at something where I can get, quick wins. So bringing in data that I hold centrally, for example, like from my finance team, because they've already done all this work on formatting it and reconciling it and notating it. Can I bring that into a system that gives me a very, very quick picture of what's going on in my business, in my carbon footprint? And then based on that, I can then start making some decisions around like what I want to do, including what my next steps will be. Right. So I would just say, like, get stuck in. I think you can get started a lot quicker than people think, and get to that point, within a couple of weeks of starting, even faster than that. And then you can look at, going into more detail on those like really impactful areas of your business, or based on like your goal, you might choose like not to do that at all, right? But at least you're tracking something and you have an idea of what's going on in the business. So I think Consequence is a software platform. So, I'm sort of plugging it there. But even if you didn't work with Consequence, I think a software platform is the right way to go, because the last thing you want is to be going backwards and forwards on hundreds of emails with consultants, or hiring people internally to like solve this problem. I think it can be solved for a minimal investment in time and money, using a software platform.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm not getting paid at all to plug Consequence, but I agree. It was super for us. It was very easy to get started. It was very easy to. I don't have to do much each month. Maybe upload the stats and stuff, and then the dashboard gets updated and the offsets are provided and all that kind of stuff. So it's super easy. But as you say, check out any of them. But I certainly would say, yeah, you're right. It's easy to get started. But yeah, no, thanks for coming on today and sharing your insights. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, best place to go is to the website. So that's consequence.world. And you can get in contact with us there. You can find us on LinkedIn. Again, search for consequence.world on that. And those are the two best places to find us.
Perfect. Thanks again, and speak soon.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.